Welcome to the final episode of Let's Talk Bwlb Season 2. I'm delighted that you're joining us. Over this season, we've explored a broad range of topics, from climate change in schools to greening our cities to COP15 and COP26 and nature-based solutions. We've spoken to leading figures in the environmental sector from around the world and practitioners, including many Bwlb members, who are making a difference every day through their work, and today's episode is no different. Today we're going to be exploring green and blue social prescribing, but more of that in a moment. It's really important that we say a huge thank you to our Series 2 sponsor, Thames Water, whose support across the full season has meant that we can share these conversations with you. Bwlb is a charity always working to deliver public benefit across the water and environmental space, and this pod is just one way that we're able to do that. So if your organisation is interested in supporting Season 3, then do get in touch. I'm Niki Roach, and Let's Talk Bwlb is a Bwlb podcast. I think that one of Bwlb's real strengths is the breadth of topics that our members have expertise in and the depth of that expertise, and we'll be shining a light on both of these today. We've got a fantastic final interview coming up in a moment with Stephanie Smith from the Bwlb Bradford programme. But before we hear from Stephanie, I'm joined by another fantastic co-host, Maya Butler. Welcome, Maya. I'm so pleased you can join us.
Thank you so much, Niki. It's really great to be here, and thank you for your time. And to the listeners, thank you so much for listening.
Maya is the Regional Environmental and Health Lead for Natural England for the South East. And previously, Maya's held a breadth of roles across Natural England, covering topics as broad as environmental stewardship, licensing of marine protected areas, the England Coastal Path, and climate change mitigation and resilience. A true systems thinker. So it's a great pleasure to have you as my co-host today, Maya, as we navigate this topic. As usual, Maya and I are going to listen to our guest interview together, and then we'll discuss her reflections. So our guest interview today is with Stephanie Smith, the Bwlb Bradford Programme Sustainability Manager and an NHS clinical entrepreneur and the founder of Purpose Steps. And Stephanie has a background in public health. Her practical experience working with this topic in communities in Bradford shines through. And I was really interested to hear about the health inequalities that exist and their links to green social prescribing.
98% of black people within the UK live in urban areas. They don't have a green space within 10 minutes of their home. People are then disproportionately affected by high levels of polluted air, and not having the access to a local green space, which we know is like a natural buffer for life's sort of stresses and challenges. So it's really important that I think some health inequalities are addressed.
So, Maya, before we head to our interview with Stephanie, can you start by telling us what is green and blue social prescribing?
Green and blue social prescribing is essentially specifically designed interventions for people with a defined health need. So people, for instance, who might be suffering from loneliness, social isolation, certain aspects of depression. And that's then delivered by trained and qualified practitioners in a green and blue setting. So things like green gyms or wild swimming. And essentially, Niki, what happened was back in 2019, we had the NHS long-term plan. And that basically recognised that as the NHS stands currently, it's not long-term going to be very sustainable. You know, our populations are ageing, and with that, they're getting increasingly more ailments. And so in order to navigate the care system, we had to ensure that we had something that was in place for the individuals at the right time and at the right place for them. And so the NHS long-term plan was born. And within that, the promise really was to have what we deem as social prescribing link workers. And by 2021, the idea was that 1,500 would come into post. And thankfully, COVID hasn't actually slowed that process down. And by 2024, the aim is that about 4,500 will come in. And these outstanding colleagues are people who will create personalised plans with individuals so that they talk to them and they ask them what they can get from the community, from social enterprise groups, and that will help them with an alternative therapy measure, if that makes sense.
It does. That's perfect. Thank you. And you work for Natural England, and we've got listeners all over the world. So can you give them a feel for what, I guess, their role is in this area of social prescribing?
Nature England is an executive non-departmental public body, so it's sponsored by the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which probably your listeners might be more acquainted with, and essentially we're the government's advisor for the natural environment in England. We help to protect and restore our natural world, and we do that through a real breadth and remit of our work, so anything spanning from farm advice to marine licensing and wildlife licensing to public access, climate change, and ultimately our aim is to protect the environment and enhance it for future generations to come.
OK, so time for this episode's big interview. Let's hear from Steph. And I started by asking her what green blue social prescribing meant to her.
So green social prescribing is how we look at people's mental health, mental well-being and their physical health, and how we can link that to their access of green space to improve health quality and quality of life. And the NHS is committing to expanding really within this area and looking at how we can bridge the gap between people and their environment and their access to nature. Nature often acts as a natural buffer to life's sort of experiences. A lot of people have access to this wonderful resource, and what we like to see is people really connecting with that environment and utilising it to ensure that they really get the best for their mental health and their mental well-being.
And on a practical note, how does it work? Is it I go to a GP and I get a prescription?
For social prescribing, it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a prescription to green space. It can be somebody who enjoys walking in open green space, or it can be somebody who enjoys gardening and growing their own food, who has that natural protection and natural buffer. But there's an element of prescribing within it, which GPs are seeing is a much more sort of area which it can have a profound impact on people's mental health. And it's really what matters to that individual and how we can link in mental health and well-being surrounding what matters the most to that individual.
Give me a sense of what you're up to. Obviously, you work in Bradford, here in West Yorkshire. Can you give me a feel for what green social prescribing looks like on the ground in Bradford?
I work across many sort of different social prescribing schemes here in Bradford, and we have a very unique population compared to the rest of the UK. We're a very sort of multi-ethnic population within Bradford, and green social prescribing for us is all about encouraging people to reap the rewards and access nature more in sort of everyday life. So that could be taking walks to local countryside areas, or that could be engaging in cook and eat sessions. So right from growing their own food from the ground to getting that food onto plate, to utilising that, within a household, and what does that look like within that household space, particularly within the area of Girlington, where, because it's quite a densely populated area, there's quite a lot of air pollution within the area. They don't have a local sort of countryside nature walk that they can embark on within sort of 10 minutes of their home surroundings. So one thing that we have done is encouraged a local community organisation to develop a local green space, which has previously been used as a sort of dumping site, fly tipping and that type of thing. Well, it has attracted that type of thing in the past. And we saw this space and identified it and saw that it had a lot of potential. At the heart of that community, is a lot of culture and is a very established community over the years. We have a lot of different generations within this community, but the one thing that they're lacking is access to green space. So we've developed a plan to invest into this green space along with other organisations within Bradford. It's very much a collaborative effort where we can turn this green space into a nature garden for the local community, and that's happened fairly quickly over quite a quick period of time. It'll bring more sort of biodiversity to the area, as well as sort of teaching the young and the old to come together and reap the rewards of nature as one.
How do you get this kind of thing off the ground?
We've worked with a number of different organisations, Bradford Council being one of them, the NHS being one of them, and also a local organisation called Greener Girlington, which reside in Girlington within that area. And we see it as if the community can really sort of get on board from the beginning of these projects and take them through to the finish of a project, and that gives them the sense of ownership over a project and also that space as well. Ultimately, our goal is to, work alongside people, not necessarily to them. So we want to work with people.
I mean, coming at it from a SciWem perspective, I would imagine listeners might be thinking the same. I'm thinking about the whole of the water cycle and where there are opportunities, for example, to slow the flow. And, we talk about sustainable urban drainage, for example, and how we can think about putting bioretention strips in to be able to capture runoff. And they're tiny bits of green, but they might run the lengths of streets, for example. I'm just interested in, are there connections being made in addition to the ones you've just talked about with, I guess, organisations that operate in the water and environment sector, or is there an opportunity, do you think, to build some relationships in that space?
At this moment in time, it's not something that we've currently explored. Our time has very much been focused on the green side of this project, but I think we recognise the benefits of Bwlb prescribing as well, and I think that'd be a really good addition to the space, having the whole sort of holistic package there.
So is Bwlb prescribing literally prescribing time near water?
Yeah, essentially. So it's encouraging people to access green spaces and blue spaces, time near water and time within nature.
That's lovely. So Greener Girlington, is that up and running? Is the space now been created, or is it still in progress?
We're ready to go now that restrictions are being lifted. We have a lot more sort of free rein to really get down on the ground and really deliver a lot of this work. We have secured the land at this moment in time, so we're going to be working on phase 1 of the build, which will be turning up all the concreted areas as it stands at the minute. And we've actually had 215 responses to the community consultation, so we have a lot of buy-in from the community, and we're keen to really sort of get them involved in, the digging aspect and ensuring that they're a part from the beginning of this project. So very sort of soon, back end of summer, we'll have started that phase.
And so is the land being owned and maintained by Greener Girlington? Is that how? Because I guess these are great ideas, but how do you sustain them?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It always comes down to capacity, I guess, doesn't it, with a lot of these things. And Greener Girlington are one organisation that are really going to support to maintain the land. However, it's also sort of buy-in from community organisations and local schools. So although Greener Girlington will support with the overall sort of maintenance of this project, they'll have a lot of backing from local schools, from local community organisations. Morrison's being one of the organisations that is supporting the initiative and have agreed to donate in kind for their employees to support with maintenance of the land and also helping us turn over this green space.
Morrison's the supermarket, I'm guessing.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, Bradford-based company. And how do you measure benefit of green social prescribing? Is that something you've started to do?
Yeah, it's something that we've definitely considered, and we've also been supported with some green social prescribing funding that will enable us to not only sort of renovate this green space, but we'll work alongside sort of local GP surgeries and their patients, to really sort of understand how this is going to benefit the lives of the users.
This series of Let's Talk WEM is sponsored by Thames Water, and it's thanks to their support that it's possible to bring this podcast to you. If your organisation would like to find out more about sponsoring an episode in this series, or even a future series of Let's Talk WEM, just go to letstalkwem.scywem.org to get all the information you need. We've talked about Greener Girlington. I know that there are other projects that you're working on, and you mentioned to me the Tiny Schools Forest, which I thought was fascinating. Could you tell me a little bit more about it?
So Tiny Forest Schools Project is a joint partnership between Bradford, the Tiny Forests and Earthwatch. And we're working alongside local schools within the Girlington area to encourage citizen science projects where there's a lack of green space and multiple levels of deprivation. We're wanting to get communities really sort of interested in nature-based projects. Children are they kind of soak up all the knowledge that they get, and they're often, they come home from school and they're tugging on mums and dads' shirts and wanting to tell you about the day. And I think we see children as really being sort of like a gateway to opening up many doors within the green health space.
And so what happens with the project? What are you actually doing on the ground?
We're encouraging schools to get involved with the creation of mini forests that children can then take home to their families and share, what they've developed within schools. So that might be, planting and potting projects and learning a little bit more about different types of plants and the benefits of different types of plants. And it might be from planting to eating different types of herb plants, or it could be, the difference between a plant which provides benefits for the environment, which help tackle sort of air pollution. So it's really more about getting children really sort of engaged in climate change and understanding, the benefits of green spaces and how they can support on a much sort of larger scale.
Scale's an interesting question, actually, and something I've been thinking about. How scalable is green social prescribing, and what are some of the challenges to it? Because it sounds like a great initiative, but I'm interested in what's difficult.
The NHS has plans to expand the number of social prescribing link workers within primary care, and they've made a commitment that by April 2021 this year that they're going to put forward another 1,000 additional link workers. A social prescribing link worker is somebody who, so if you went to your GP surgery, if you were suffering with maybe some low mood or some form of mental health problem, instead of prescribing you some medication, your GP could prescribe you some social prescribing, and within that it could be green social prescribing. But within that service they would refer you on to a link worker, and a link worker would then allow you to access other forms of support within the communities. It could be a local walking group, could be referring you to a community garden or a food growing project. I think the biggest challenges there are that there's a lot of health inequalities that currently exist, and unless these health inequalities within certain ethnicities and certain areas are addressed, then people will sort of be missed, I guess, within green social prescribing. And I think an example of that is 98% of black people within the UK live in urban areas. They don't have a green space within 10 minutes of their home. People are then disproportionately affected by high levels of polluted air, and not having the access to a local green space, which we know is like a natural buffer for life's sort of stresses and challenges. So it's really important that I think some health inequalities are addressed prior to attempting to refer people into a green social prescribing scheme where they're not necessarily going to thrive.
So if there is no service provision available because there is no green space, then social prescribing fundamentally doesn't work. So I guess that sounds like a massive challenge. And that's an interesting one for me, with my environmental hat on, is there an opportunity to do something more practical and help create those spaces in perhaps more unexpected places? So, I mean, scalability wise, Stephanie, give me a sense of, you obviously work in Bradford here in West Yorkshire. Once again, the podcast comes to Yorkshire. I make no apologies for that. I'm guessing this isn't just a Yorkshire thing. So give me a feel for sort of scalability of green social prescribing.
Across the UK, there's many different social prescribing schemes out there, and I think London have particularly done really well with a lot of their particularly green social prescribing schemes in ensuring that they have a social prescribing scheme that suits sort of the needs of every individual within their society. They have many different people representing those social prescribing schemes as well, and I think that's probably key in order for these schemes to succeed, is ensuring that there's a balance from the bottom end to the top end of a social prescribing chain.
Is there a takeaway that you'd like listeners to have, given that our listeners are likely to be people who are water and environment professionals, who might be involved in planning or engineering? What's the takeaway from you to them, Stephanie?
The biggest thing for us is to be aware that these inequalities do currently exist. And in a world where we are committed now to climate change, or kind of winning hearts and minds of people that maybe didn't want to change a while ago, it's very big on people's agenda. And whilst it is big on people's agenda, let's just please be open to understanding that there is still some inequalities that exist within people accessing green space. So if people are planning on building and developing green spaces, think about who the population is surrounding that green space that you want to develop. Who does it speak to? What's the demographics of the area? Try and work with communities, because the more that we do to communities, the wider that the gap that inequalities get. The more that we work with communities instead of doing to them, the less that gap gets. I think it's all about inclusion and just remembering to take into consideration that there are these inequalities that do exist, but we do have an option to contribute to reducing those. And that's why I believe in speaking to communities and finding out really what they would like from their area, and really sort of understanding what it is that they need, but working with them to get to those solutions instead of working and doing for them.
I think that's a wonderful summary to leave it on. Not doing to, but working with is a great sentiment.
Thank you very much, Niki.
Okay, so Maya, what are your initial thoughts on what we heard from Steph?
I agree a lot with what Steph has said, and I'm really excited actually to hear more about the Greener Girlington project. I think there's so much promise there, and really amazing work that the guys are doing in that region. We know that mental health is going to skyrocket as we come out of this pandemic, unfortunately, and social prescribing, particularly green and blue social prescribing, can really be that preventative tool as we come out. But the caveat there being that it must be done correctly and appropriately, so that when we think of things like inappropriate referrals, which unfortunately we do see with social prescribing, we do need to make sure that that is minimalised, and that we manage expectations with clients as to what social prescribing is. But if it's done correctly and appropriately, it can really save the NHS a lot of money. And what I really liked about Steph's interview, and what really resonated with us as an organisation, is it's very much about connecting more people with nature, right? It's about creating inclusivity and diversity right across the communities. And in England, we're very fortunate. We have an incredible diverse communities that come from all different sectors, from all different walks of life. And we want to make sure that our environment is suited to everybody, and everybody feels pride and responsibility of their local nature. So the other things that Steph said was very much about building on the evidence behind connecting people with nature, which as an organisation, Nature England does take very seriously. We have the People and Nature Survey, where we measure directly the benefits of people connecting with nature for their health and wider well-being. And that's been running right throughout the pandemic. And unfortunately, what's really prevalent from that, and what we can see, is that those people who might need the benefits of nature the most tend to be getting it the least. So we know that 1 in 8 households in England don't have the luxury of green space, or indeed a garden, right? So we need to start thinking much more innovatively about how do people connect, and how can we blur the boundaries between rural and urban, so that we promote much more high quality green space in an urban setting. The other thing that Steph said, which I think really hits the nail on the head, as it were, is this idea of access. And Nature England has just recently promoted our amended countryside code, which can be found on the .gov.uk website. And what we hope through that comms tool is we've showcased that landscapes are for everybody, right? And when we think of the Glover Review in particular, which is better, more connected, more resilient landscapes, with that comes people. People are at the heart of that. And so if we don't bring the people along, then unfortunately green and blue social prescribing really won't work. Steph draws upon the point about children. You know, that children can be real gatekeepers in our society, that through them parents feel encouraged to have more pride in their local landscapes. And that's absolutely right. I mean, I'm sure you have children of your own, and I'm sure you've asked on countless occasions, you know, how was your school day and what did you learn? And if we can really build that spark early on of saying, look, we have this beautiful world. You know, these things are so special to us, and there's even endemic species here that can only be found here. Let's look after it. Will hopefully bring that health and well-being aspect as well to the forefront. And right now we are doing a lot of work in this field, particularly looking at schools in very deprived urban areas. So the one that comes on the top of my mind is in Reading, where we're working with an organisation called Nature Nurture, who are doing basically wild toolkits. So trying to get teachers to encompass this environmental aspect in their school curriculum, to start thinking innovatively about the school backyard and maybe using that to facilitate discussions, especially as these kids don't have their own gardens back at home. So trying to teach them about the various fauna and flora that can be found in gardens as well.
So what kind of enablers do we need, and what already exists in order to make it possible for more people to access green and blue social prescribing?
Essentially, Natural England is looking at green and blue social prescribing through two ways. One is what we deem our green social prescribing test and trial pilots, and they've just been recently awarded 5.77 million. So we have 7 pilot sites across 5 NHS regions. They're not all in every single NHS region, because we know there's 7 of those, but in 5 of them. And the local one to myself in the southeast is in Surrey. Essentially, these 7 test and learn sites in the 5 NHS regions have been given £500,000 each, and they, over a 2-year period, will be looking at specifically green social prescribing, working with providers on the ground, as well as clinicians, commissioning groups, and integrated care systems. And it's really to understand what the enablers and barriers are to green social prescribing, so that if it works well, of course, we can scale it up in local sites, and we can also provide recommendations, costs and next steps, so that this becomes much more widespread. So those are our test and trial sites. There is also the Global Social Prescribing Alliance, which very much aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Partners on that alliance include the National Academy of Social Prescribing, the World Health Innovation Summit, and the World Health Organization. And again, the main areas of work there tend to be about increasing the narrative around social prescribing, because there's still a little bit of disconnect, especially between the clinical world and the world of actually provision, so matching that supply and demand. It's also about thinking about leadership and also embracing the different specialisms, right, when we look at social prescribing. So it's never black and white. There's a lot of grey, and when we think about nature, we could very much connect nature with the arts or with the sports, you know, and we know that vulnerable people who desperately need social prescribing will have a real interest in right across the specialisms. So if we can create a package that embodies all of them, or at least a few of them, then that would hopefully grab their attention and make them want to take part in the social prescribing venture. The Alliance also talks about sort of looking at innovative communities, learning from them, sharing best practices and harnessing digital solutions, because as awful as this pandemic has been, some real benefits of it has shown the power of technology. And, you know, it's also shown that there's a real inequality between those who may not have digital platforms and those that do. And we need to bridge that gap. And then finally, we have the National Academy of Social Prescribing, and Natural England have 2 seconded staff out. And that really enables the organisation to have an overarching national image of what's going on. NASP is also about improving the evidence, promoting good learning and advocating for social prescribing, whether that's working with academic institutions across the country or really promoting and advocating some of these incredible voluntary community and faith social enterprise groups who are doing amazing things on the ground. So there are a lot of enablers, there are a lot of people out there who are really passionate about this stuff, and there's also some great partnerships that are coming out from it.
Maya, what's the ambition? Give me a feel for what you want to achieve.
There are a few things we're doing currently. So when I think of sort of short, medium and long-term goals, certainly right now, we are working with a variety of partners, including Arts Council, Sports England, Historic England, NHS, Money and Advice Service, and the Pension Service. Right now we're supporting what's called the Thriving Communities programme. What the Thriving Communities Fund does, and it's important at this point to note, it's very different from those test and trial pilots that I just mentioned that have had huge amounts of money put in. These are far more smaller scale, and we have 37 community and voluntary and faith sector groups right across England who've received a pot of money up to 50,000 for a year, and they have to test social prescribing. Now, there's no need to do green and blue per se. It can be any form of social prescribing, and that's because it reflects the funders, right? The funders are right across the specialisms. So we've got that in place right now, and that's hugely exciting. In the Southeast, we have 6 of the 37. They come from groups like leisure centres, horticultural groups. So what they bring is a real breadth of knowledge and experience. And also we're starting to find, as they share their findings and their learnings together, that there's a lot of interconnectedness that we can work on. We then have the Learning Together programme, and that's really focusing on people that weren't able to get funding, but yet were very, very good and are delivering some exceptional services. So we certainly didn't want to lose them in that process. What we're giving them the opportunity through the Learning Together programme is, as it says on the tin, learning together and sharing practices. And we actually bring social prescribing link workers in so that they can talk about what their barriers are, right? One of the biggest things I've learned very early on in this role is that there is a huge disconnect, right? So especially as we come out of this pandemic, social prescribing link workers have no idea where to refer their patients to, A, because half the services they used to refer to don't exist anymore, or they just don't know what's around in the local area because it's not very well advertised. And voluntary community and social enterprise groups feel exactly the same. They don't know where to actually advertise their services to. So by bringing them all around this virtual table, we can bridge that gap once more. And then finally, we're looking at, particularly with green and blue, is long-term funding. And that's the golden nugget for social prescribing. One of the biggest barriers right now is long-term sustainable funding, because most of it is grant funded. So working with NAS to try and create solutions towards that, whether that's through accreditation schemes so that social prescribing link workers feel really assured that when they do send these vulnerable people out, that they are safeguarded. But also we've got some great ambitions with our pharmaceutical works. So down in the Somer Valley in Somerset, we are right now working with major water companies down there because there's a huge problem right now with a lot of pollution entering the waterways, particularly pharmaceutical pollution. And we're realising that a lot of individuals that need to take tablets or medication to elevate things like depression, it's actually entering the watercourse. And what we're trying to do is bring social prescribing as a tool to reduce this pollution. So by saying to primary care networks, so like your local GPs, that actually these individuals might benefit better from social prescribing, and actually we could reduce this pollution quite significantly. And we're seeing some amazing impacts down in the Somer Valley of this as well. I think just to end really, it's important to note that we are very aware that people that maybe do suffer from ailments like depression or other things might not benefit from social prescribing either. It's just a tool, and if they need to come back and do have medicine, there is that option as well, of course.
And that's a beautiful link, really, between the work of the healthcare sector and the work of many of our listeners in the water and environment sector. One final question, really. What's your biggest takeaway from the interview that we heard with Steph?
There is always so much more we can do, and that this is an ever-growing beast, as it were, for want of a better word. You know, this is something that is really picking up speed right now. There is a huge political will, because as I said, it's incredibly timely, and we need to make sure that this doesn't become just a fad, that this actually becomes part of our livelihoods, and that this becomes a solution, really. I think something that Steph really alluded to, even if it was indirectly, was this thing about we need to speak the right language and we need to know who our audience is. I think there is still a lot of buy-in that needs to happen on the clinical world front. We've got some fantastic GPs who are real advocates for green social prescribing. So people like Dr. William Bird, who were the very first people that started doing Walking for Health, for instance. But there's still some disconnect as to, is social prescribing going to really work? And equally with patients, they often feel they're being just palmed off, right? I can do a walk anytime. Why is my doctor telling me to take a walk? When actually we know they're just not taking the walk, and actually they do need that prescription as a reason to take the walk. I think that was the biggest take home. There's always more to do, but I think right now that there's a real opportunity here. And, we can start linking this to huge problems like climate and biodiversity loss as well, and crises, by trying to get people to really feel pride in their environment and take ownership in it when they see the benefits it gives to them as well.
One of my biggest takeaways is that social prescribing is probably one of the most connected topics we've covered on the pod. Bringing public health and healthcare and water and the environment all together and really centering all of that around people. It's fascinating. I've loved finding out more. I hope listeners are thinking about where their roles in social prescribing might feature. Thank you for joining us. I really hope you've enjoyed hearing from both Stephanie and from Maya. That's it for season 2. I hope you've enjoyed listening as much as I've enjoyed sharing these conversations with you. If you've missed any of season 1 or 2, then head back to your podcast app and listen back. There are some corkers in there. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to the pod on your podcast player so you're ready for season 3, which I can't wait to bring you soon. All that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to Stephanie Smith and my wonderful co-host, Maya Butler. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you.
That's it, everyone. Stay safe. See you next time.
Let's Talk WEM is produced by Bwlb. Bwlb Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.